In the quiet suburbs of Sacramento, California, a story unfolded that would later shock and horrify the public. This is the tale of Richard Chase, later dubbed the Vampire of Sacramento, a man whose actions during the late 1970s would etch his name into the annals of America's most notorious criminals. This narrative will explore his life, his crimes, and the complex interplay of factors that led to his infamous spree. Early life. Richard Trenton Chase was born on May 23, 1950, in Santa Clara County, California. His childhood, at first glance, might have appeared ordinary to an outside observer, yet beneath the surface, there were early signs of the turbulence that would define his later years. His parents were often described as strict disciplinarians. Richard's father, a former soldier, imposed a rigid and sometimes harsh regimen, while his mother, fraught with her own set of neuroses, contributed to a home environment filled with tension and anxiety. From an early age, Richard exhibited signs of what mental health professionals might now recognize as early onset of mental illness. Signs of distress. By the time he was 10 years old, Richard exhibited behaviors that aligned with the McDonald triad, a set of traits that some psychologists consider indicators of future violent tendencies. These included enuresis, bedwetting, pyromania, and a disturbing interest in torturing animals. Neighbors and classmates recalled incidents where Richard mutilated and killed animals, often curiously examining their insides. His school performance was erratic. Teachers noted that while he could be exceptionally focused at times, he often seemed distant or disengaged, staring blankly out of windows or muttering to himself. His social interactions were equally troubled. He had few friends and was often the target of bullies. Adolescence and mental health. As Richard transitioned into adolescence, his mental health visibly deteriorated. He became increasingly paranoid, often speaking of invisible enemies or conspiracies against him. His parents, concerned but also constrained by their own limitations and the stigma of mental illness at the time, were reluctant to seek psychiatric help. In his late teens, Richard's behavior grew more alarming. He would lock himself in his room for hours, sometimes days, emerging only at odd hours. His hygiene suffered, and he became gaunt, with a pallor that alarmed those who still maintained contact with him. Early adulthood. By his early 20s, Richard had moved out of his parents' home, but life on his own proved challenging. He lived in various apartments, often evicted for erratic behavior or failure to pay rent. His mental health continued to decline, marked by periods of hospitalization. During one such stay, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, but adherence to treatment was sporadic. Neighbors at various apartments where he lived reported odd behavior, hearing noises late at night, seeing him bring large quantities of animals into his apartment, and noticing stains on his clothing and around his dwelling. The descent. By the mid-1970s, Richard's existence had become increasingly nomadic and isolated. He drifted between different residences, stayed briefly with relatives, and at times, lived in his car. His physical appearance became more disheveled, and his interactions with others were marked by awkwardness and sudden anger. It was during this period that Richard's fantasies began to take a darker turn. He developed a fascination with blood, believing it held special powers and that he needed it to survive. This belief would soon manifest in actions that crossed the line from disturbing fantasy into gruesome reality. As Richard Chase entered the latter half of his 20s, the fragile threads that held his world together began to unravel at an alarming pace. His mental state deteriorated further, his behavior grew increasingly erratic, and his life descended into a series of dark obsessions that would soon manifest in terrifying ways. Escalation of symptoms. By the late 1970s, Richard's delusions had intensified. He believed that his own blood was turning into powder and that he was being poisoned by someone. To counteract this, he began to ingest animals' blood and organs, which he believed would rejuvenate his blood and heal his body. This macabre practice was driven by his distorted perception of physical and mental health, further exacerbated by his isolation. Neighbors and acquaintances reported seeing him with bloodstains on his clothes. He was often seen rummaging through garbage bins, possibly looking for dead animals. His apartment, when he had one, was a scene of chaos, unclean with strange odors, and occasionally marked by the presence of blood and animal remains. Further isolation and paranoid schizophrenia. Richard's interactions with the healthcare system were sporadic and largely ineffective. Despite several hospitalizations and a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, treatment was inconsistent. He often refused medication, claiming it poisoned him further. His lack of compliance with treatment recommendations, combined with his increasing social withdrawal, created a dangerous mix that went largely unchecked by any form of community support or persistent medical supervision. During this period, his family tried to intervene, but their efforts were met with hostility and paranoia. Richard accused them of being part of the conspiracy against him. This reaction only served to deepen his isolation, as family members, overwhelmed and unequipped to handle his illness, pulled away. Bizarre behaviors and warning signs. Richard's behavior became more bizarre over time. He developed a particular fixation with Nazis and UFOs, often combining these elements into elaborate conspiracy theories. He believed that these forces were after him because he possessed special knowledge or because he was inherently important in some cosmic struggle. In one disturbing episode, he entered a public square and loudly proclaimed that he was being persecuted, that his heart had stopped beating, and that everyone's blood was in danger. Such public displays alarmed those around him, but without a coherent system to address his deteriorating condition, responses were limited to temporary detentions or short-term treatments. The turn toward human victims. The turning point in Richard's descent came when his fantasies about blood consumption began to involve human targets. He started with small acts of violence, such as capturing birds in the park or stealing dogs from neighbors' yards, which he would later mutilate at home. These acts were rehearsals, driven by his belief in the necessity of fresh blood for his survival. His method of operation began to take a darker turn as he tested boundaries, breaking into homes to steal objects associated with his obsessions or to leave marks as a way of expressing his presence and his growing need for control over his environment. These invasions marked a shift from disorganized behavior to more targeted actions, reflecting a significant escalation in his risk to others. Richard's ability to move from animals to humans showed a complete breakdown in any moral or ethical boundaries, driven by his delusional beliefs. Premonitions of greater horror. As 1977 drew to a close, the city of Sacramento remained unaware of the full extent of the threat walking its streets. Richard Chase was a ticking time bomb, his actions becoming increasingly confident and his delusions more grandiose. The community's inability to effectively integrate mental health interventions with law enforcement oversight meant that Richard roamed relatively unchecked. This chapter closes on the eve of his first known human attack, a point at which Richard Chase would transition from a troubled individual to a notorious figure in the annals of American criminal history. His progression reflects a series of missed interventions and the tragic consequences of a profoundly disturbed mind left to fend for itself in a world it no longer understood. As the year 1977 wound to a close, Richard Chase stood on the brink of committing acts that would cement his infamy. The fragmented world within which he lived had contracted to a singular dark fixation, his need for blood. This obsession, once directed at animals, was about to horrifically expand its scope, marking his transition from a disturbed individual to a serial killer. The first known human attack. On December 29, 1977, the quiet of a Sacramento suburb was shattered by a gruesome discovery. Ambrose Griffin, a 51-year-old engineer and father of two, was fatally shot in his driveway in a seemingly random drive-by shooting. Griffin was helping his wife bring groceries into their home when he collapsed, struck by bullets from a passing vehicle. The randomness of the act, the seeming lack of motive, and the brutality of the attack left the community and local law enforcement baffled and alarmed. Investigators initially had few leads. The absence of a clear motive, the stealth of the attack, and the lack of connections between the victim and any potential suspects left the police grappling in the dark. However, ballistics eventually linked a .22 caliber gun used in the attack, a gun that would later be traced back to Richard Chase. Further escalation. The murder of Ambrose Griffin was just the beginning. Chase's delusions and compulsions were tightening around him, driving him toward further violence. Each act was feeding his distorted beliefs about survival, pushing him deeper into a cycle of bloodshed. In January 1978, not long after the murder of Griffin, Chase attempted to enter the home of a woman in Sacramento, but finding that her doors were locked, he walked away. Richard later explained to investigators that he took locked doors as a sign that he was not welcome, but unlocked doors were an invitation to enter. This belief guided his movements on January 23, 1978, when he found his next victims. The Wallen tragedy. On that day, Richard entered the home of Terry Wallen, a young pregnant mother, through an unlocked back door. The horror that unfolded thereafter was unspeakable. Terry was preparing to take out the garbage when she was confronted and brutally attacked by Chase. He shot her 3 times, killing her, before mutilating her body in his quest for blood. Chase's actions were both methodical and chaotic, indicative of his severe psychosis meshed with a grotesque curiosity about the human body. The brutality of the Wallen murder brought a new urgency to the police investigation. The savagery of the attack, coupled with the evidence left at the scene, pointed to a perpetrator who was not just dangerous but also deeply disturbed. Growing fear and investigation. The Sacramento community was now in the grips of growing fear. A task force was assembled to capture the vampire killer, a moniker that the press had begun to use in reference to the bloody nature of the attacks. Forensic evidence collected from the Griffin and Wallen crime scenes was meticulously analyzed, and a psychological profile of the suspect began to take shape, a profile that pointed to someone deeply psychotic, driven by compulsions that were both predatory and pathological. As law enforcement raced to connect the dots, Richard Chase remained a shadow among them, his actions becoming increasingly desperate and disorganized. His mental state deteriorated further, fueled by the paranoia and the bloodlust that had taken over his psyche. Continued descent into madness. In the days following the Wallen murder, Richard's behavior became even more erratic. He was seen by neighbors and local residents carrying a blood-stained box, his clothing often dirty and disheveled. His physical appearance, combined with his increasingly bizarre public conduct, started to draw attention, yet his connection to the murders had not yet been made. The community was on edge, the police were on high alert, and the net was closing in around Richard Chase, though he himself seemed oblivious to the impending consequences of his actions. As January drew to a close, the full horror of his descent into madness was about to be revealed in even more appalling detail. As the winter of 1978 deepened, the city of Sacramento was gripped by a palpable sense of dread. The brutal nature of the crimes committed by the man the media had dubbed the Vampire of Sacramento had shaken the community to its core. The police were under immense pressure to stop the killer before he could strike again. Unbeknownst to them, Richard Chase was spiraling further into his delusions, poised to commit even more heinous acts. The harrowing continuation. Only a few days after the murder of Terry Wallen, Richard Chase found his way into another home, one that would culminate in one of the most horrifying crime scenes in American criminal history. On January 27, 1978, Chase entered the home of 38-year-old Evelyn Miroth. Inside, he encountered Evelyn, her 6-year-old son Jason, her 22-month-old nephew, David, and a neighbor, Dan Meredith. The sequence of events that unfolded was nightmarish. Dan Meredith was the first to be shot as he entered the hallway after hearing a noise. Following Meredith's murder, Chase turned his attention to Evelyn and the two children. Evelyn and Jason were brutally murdered, with Chase engaging in post-mortem mutilations and acts of necrophilia. The infant, David, was abducted from the scene, his body found later discarded not far from Chase's apartment, subjected to similar grotesque violations. Immediate response and mobilization. The discovery of the crime scene at the Miroth residence marked a critical turning point in the investigation. The sheer brutality and apparent randomness of the attack galvanized law enforcement agencies. The FBI was called in, and a massive manhunt began. Forensic teams worked meticulously to gather evidence, while profilers developed a psychological profile of the killer, describing him as a disorganized, paranoid individual with possible schizophrenic tendencies. Investigators noted that Chase's behavior deviated from typical serial killer patterns. His killings were frenzied, lacking premeditation typical of other serial killers, and his motives were delusional rather than predatory. The community's paralysis. The Sacramento community lived in a state of near paralysis. Fear was palpable, with residents double-checking locks and being suspicious of any strangers. Community meetings were held, and the police issued guidelines on safety, including keeping doors locked and not opening them to strangers under any circumstances. Local media covered the story extensively, with daily updates that often included interviews with behavioral experts and calls for public vigilance. The term Vampire of Sacramento became a chilling reminder of the threat that loomed over the city, adding a layer of almost supernatural horror to the already terrified public psyche. Chase's arrest and shocking revelations. Richard Chase's capture came about due to a combination of forensic evidence and Chase's own deteriorating mental state leading to mistakes. His vehicle, seen at the Miroth crime scene by a witness, was identified and found covered in blood. When police arrested Chase, they found blood-soaked clothing and shoes in his apartment, along with a .22 caliber handgun used in the murders. Most damningly, they found a collection of articles related to anatomy and diseases, as well as blenders containing human blood and body parts, revealing the depth of his madness. Upon arrest, Chase was almost indifferent, a stark contrast to the savagery of his crimes. His apartment was a tableau of horror, with blood-stained walls and floors, and the refrigerated remains of his victims stored alongside food items. A city confronts its nightmare. In the aftermath of Chase's arrest, Sacramento had to confront the reality that such unspeakable acts had occurred within its boundaries. The community struggled with a mix of relief and lasting trauma. Families mourned openly, while mental health professionals discussed the implications of the case for public health and safety. As the case moved to trial, the public and legal system grappled with questions about mental illness, the death penalty, and the nature of evil. Richard Chase, meanwhile, remained mostly silent, a specter at the center of discussions about how society deals with its most damaged and dangerous individuals. The arrest of Richard Chase brought a temporary relief to the terrified community of Sacramento, but it also ushered in a period of intense scrutiny and public debate. The trial of Richard Chase was not just a legal proceeding, it became a focal point for discussions on mental health, the justice system, and the capacity of society to handle individuals with severe psychotic disorders. Preparation for trial. As the trial date approached, the preparation involved extensive legal and psychiatric evaluations. The defense team, anticipating the challenge of facing overwhelming evidence of Chase's guilt, focused on his mental state. They aimed to prove that Chase was not guilty by reason of insanity, arguing that his actions were the direct result of his untreated schizophrenia. Prosecutors, however, prepared to show that despite his mental illness, Chase was aware of his actions and understood the wrongfulness of his deeds, thus meeting the legal criteria for sanity under California law at the time. Psychiatric evaluations. Multiple psychiatric evaluations were conducted to determine Chase's mental state. These assessments painted a picture of a deeply disturbed individual. Psychiatrists diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia, noting his history of hallucinations, delusions, and extreme disorganization in thought and behavior. One psychiatrist noted that Chase believed his crimes were necessary to prevent his own death, a belief rooted in his delusion that his blood was turning into powder. Despite these findings, there was significant debate over whether Chase could differentiate between right and wrong, a key component in determining legal sanity. The court proceedings. The trial officially began in 1979 and quickly became a media sensation. Every day, journalists and spectators filled the courtroom, eager to catch a glimpse of the man dubbed the Vampire of Sacramento. The proceedings were often graphic, with detailed descriptions of the murders and the state of the crime scenes. Evidence presented included the blood-stained items from Chase's apartment and chilling testimonies from forensic experts who described the extent of the mutilations and the condition of the victims. Witnesses, including surviving family members of the victims and those who had interacted with Chase in the days leading up to his arrest, painted a picture of a man living in the throes of deep psychosis, often disconnected from reality. The defense and the challenge. The defense faced the difficult task of humanizing Chase in the eyes of the jury, an effort complicated by the gruesome nature of his crimes. They brought in family members and former friends who testified about Chase's deteriorating condition over the years, highlighting missed opportunities for intervention that might have prevented the tragedy. In contrast, the prosecution argued that Chase's ability to plan his attacks and his attempts to cover up his actions indicated a level of awareness that met the legal standards for sanity. They pointed to the calculated manner in which he chose his victims and how he managed to evade capture for weeks. Public and media impact. Outside the courtroom, the trial spurred widespread discussion about the intersection of mental health and criminal justice. Advocates for mental health reform used the case as an example of the failures of the system to properly diagnose, treat, and manage individuals with severe psychiatric conditions. The media coverage, while often sensational, also prompted public debates on how such cases should be handled, questioning whether justice was truly being served or if society was merely reacting to its own fears. This period also saw an increase in advocacy for victims' rights, with many arguing that the focus on Chase's mental health overshadowed the suffering of the victims and their families. Conclusion of the trial. The trial concluded with Chase found guilty of 6 counts of first-degree murder. The jury rejected the insanity defense, determining that despite his mental illness, he understood the nature and wrongfulness of his actions. This verdict set the stage for the next phase of legal proceedings to determine his sentence. The conviction of Richard Chase marked a critical juncture in the intersection of criminal justice and mental health advocacy. As the sentencing phase began, the community, still reeling from the shock of his crimes, awaited the final decision with bated breath. This phase would not only determine Chase's fate, but also contribute to an ongoing national conversation about the adequacy of mental health support systems and the moral implications of sentencing individuals with severe psychiatric disorders. The sentencing phase. Following his conviction for 6 counts of first-degree murder, the court moved to the sentencing phase. The primary question was whether Richard Chase should face the death penalty. The gravity of his crimes made him eligible for this ultimate sentence under California law, but his defense argued that his severe mental illness should mitigate the punishment to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. During this phase, both sides presented further testimony about Chase's mental health. Expert witnesses for the defense detailed his psychotic episodes, emphasizing that he lived in a perpetual state of fear and delusion that compelled him to commit these acts as a form of self-preservation. They argued that his condition was exacerbated by a lack of sustained medical intervention and societal neglect. Conversely, the prosecution argued that despite his mental illness, Chase had demonstrated premeditation and awareness of his actions, as evidenced by his attempts to cover up his crimes and evade police detection. They maintained that the severity and brutality of his crimes warranted the maximum penalty. Community impact and public opinion. The sentencing phase was highly publicized, drawing attention not only from local media but also from national outlets. The public opinion was divided. Some advocated for the death penalty, viewing it as a just response to the heinous nature of the crimes. Others, particularly advocates for mental health reform, argued that executing a mentally ill man would not serve justice but rather highlight the failures of the system that allowed his condition to deteriorate unchecked. This public debate spilled over into various forums, from newspaper op-eds and television panels to community meetings and academic symposiums. The case became a touchstone for discussions about how society should treat its most vulnerable and dangerous individuals. Verdict and reaction. After extensive deliberations, the jury sentenced Richard Chase to death, deciding that the nature of his crimes outweighed the considerations regarding his mental health. The verdict was met with mixed reactions. While some felt justice had been served, others lamented the outcome as a missed opportunity to address broader systemic issues. The sentence also intensified discussions in the psychiatric and legal communities about the need for reforms in how the justice system interacts with the mentally ill. These discussions often cited Chase's case as a clear indicator of the gaps in mental health services and the criminal justice system's handling of mentally ill defendants. Legacy and institutional changes. In the years following the trial, Richard Chase became a case study in numerous fields, including criminal psychology, law, and mental health advocacy. His case prompted legislative and institutional changes, particularly in how mental health assessments are conducted for criminal defendants and the support structures available for the mentally ill within the penal system. Furthermore, the case contributed to a gradual shift in public perception regarding mental illness, with increasing advocacy for destigmatization and better funding for mental health services. It highlighted the critical need for early intervention and continuous support for those with severe mental disorders. Continuing education and policy reforms. Educational institutions and policy-making bodies began to incorporate findings from the case into training programs for law enforcement, psychiatric professionals, and legal practitioners. Workshops and seminars developed in the aftermath emphasized a multidisciplinary approach to handling similar cases, promoting cooperation between legal authorities, mental health experts, and community services to prevent such tragedies. As the chapter closes on the sentencing of Richard Chase, the ripple effects of his case continue to influence policies and practices. The societal reflection it prompted remains a pertinent example of the complex interplay between law, ethics, and psychiatry. Following the conviction and sentencing of Richard Chase, his case left a lasting impact on various sectors, including legal practices, psychiatric treatment, and community safety programs. As society grappled with the horror of his actions, the demand for systemic change grew, emphasizing the need for more effective integration of mental health care and criminal justice. Forensic psychiatry advancements. The Chase case underscored the challenges of dealing with mentally ill offenders in the justice system. In response, advancements in forensic psychiatry were accelerated. Training programs for forensic psychologists and psychiatrists began to emphasize the assessment of risk and the management of severe mental disorders in the context of criminal behavior. These programs aim to equip professionals with the tools needed to better identify and treat individuals exhibiting violent tendencies linked to psychiatric conditions. Legislative changes. Legislators responded to the public outcry by re-evaluating the laws concerning the treatment of mentally ill criminals. Changes included more rigorous standards for the insanity defense and the implementation of mandated psychiatric evaluations for all defendants claiming mental illness. Additionally, laws were introduced to ensure continuous mental health care for incarcerated individuals and to establish protocols for their reintegration into society upon release. Enhanced community safety programs. Recognizing the need to prevent similar tragedies, community safety programs were bolstered. Initiatives were launched to educate the public about mental health issues and to destigmatize seeking help. Community-based mental health services received increased funding, focusing on early intervention for individuals displaying signs of severe mental illness. Police training also adapted to include techniques for de-escalating situations involving mentally unstable individuals. Officers were trained to recognize signs of mental distress and to collaborate with mental health professionals to manage such incidents effectively and compassionately. Impact on mental health services. The Chase case highlighted significant gaps in mental health services, particularly in the continuity of care and the management of patients with complex, high-risk profiles. In response, mental health providers re-evaluated their service models. Efforts were made to improve the coordination between different service providers, ensuring that individuals like Chase would not slip through the cracks due to transitions between different care systems. New models of integrated care were developed, where psychiatric services, housing support, and vocational training were provided in a coordinated manner. These models aim to address the holistic needs of mentally ill individuals, reducing the risk of isolation and neglect. Public awareness and education. The media coverage of the Chase trial had initially sensationalized his moniker, the Vampire of Sacramento, focusing on the gruesome details of his crimes. Over time, this coverage shifted towards a more informed and sensitive discussion of the intersection of mental illness and criminality. Documentaries and educational programs began exploring the broader societal implications of the case, advocating for better mental health care and more informed public policies. Educational campaigns were launched to teach the public how to recognize and respond to signs of mental illness in their communities. These campaigns aim to reduce stigma and to encourage early intervention, promoting a more proactive and preventative approach to mental health crises. Reflections in academia. Academic institutions use the Chase case as a catalyst for discussion on ethical, legal, and psychological issues related to criminal justice and mental health. Conferences and symposia were held, bringing together experts from various fields to discuss improvements in policy and practice. Research into the causes of violent behavior in mentally ill individuals was intensified, with findings contributing to changes in both treatment approaches and legal practices. Looking forward. As systems and policies evolved in response to the tragic events catalyzed by Richard Chase, it became clear that effective management of similar cases required a multidisciplinary approach. The lessons learned continued to influence practices and provoke discussion on how best to balance the rights and needs of mentally ill individuals with the imperative to protect public safety. Following the tragic and unsettling case of Richard Chase, the imperative to overhaul psychiatric care became more pronounced. This chapter delves into the transformative approaches that emerged in psychiatric care, focusing on the integration of mental health services and the criminal justice system, and the personal narratives that underscore the profound impacts of these changes. Integrated care models. The fallout from the Chase case acted as a catalyst for the development of integrated care models. These models aim to provide a seamless continuum of care for individuals with serious mental health issues, especially those with the potential for violent behavior. The new approach was multidisciplinary, combining psychiatric treatment, social services, and community support. One such model was the assertive community treatment, ACT teams that became prevalent in areas with high rates of mental health issues. ACT teams are mobile, working with patients in their community settings, ensuring that treatment plans are followed and adjusted as needed. These teams coordinate with law enforcement to handle crises and prevent the escalation of potentially violent situations. Case study, a new approach in action. To illustrate the impact of these integrated care models, consider the story of John, a young man diagnosed with schizophrenia who exhibited violent tendencies. Similar to Chase, John struggled with delusions and paranoia. However, unlike Chase, John became part of a community-based treatment program shortly after his symptoms began to intensify. John's treatment team included a psychiatrist, a social worker, and a community police officer trained in mental health crisis intervention. This team worked together to ensure he received consistent medication management, family therapy, and social support. Importantly, John's family was involved in his treatment plan, educated about his condition, and supported in crisis prevention. This integrated approach helped prevent John from becoming isolated or incarcerated. Instead, he maintained his treatment regimen and stayed engaged with his community under close supervision, illustrating a successful outcome that was not possible in Chase's time. Training and education reforms. The revelations of systemic failures highlighted by Chase's actions led to significant reforms in education and training for psychiatric professionals. Universities and medical schools revamped their curricula to include more extensive training on the management of psychotic disorders, particularly those associated with violent behavior. Training now emphasized early detection and intervention, teaching upcoming medical professionals to recognize the warning signs of escalating mental illness. Simulation-based training became a standard part of the curriculum, preparing students for real-life scenarios involving mentally ill individuals at risk of violent behavior. Public and professional education. Beyond professional training, public education initiatives were also enhanced. Communities launched programs aimed at destigmatizing mental illness and educating the public on how to recognize and respond to mental health crises. These programs were designed to encourage people to seek help for themselves or others without fear of judgment or repercussions. Enhanced legal and ethical frameworks. The intersection of mental health and law was profoundly affected by the Chase case. New legal frameworks were established to better manage the rights and treatment of mentally ill individuals who had committed crimes. These frameworks included laws that require the consideration of mental health in sentencing and the provision of psychiatric care to incarcerated individuals. Ethical considerations also evolved, with greater emphasis placed on the balance between protecting public safety and respecting the rights and needs of the mentally ill. Debates and discussions in ethical forums, such as medical ethics boards and legal symposiums, often reference the lessons learned from Chase's mishandling. Reflections on progress and challenges. While significant progress was made, challenges remained. Resource allocation, consistent policy implementation across jurisdictions, and ongoing public stigma presented hurdles to the full realization of effective mental health care integration. The story of Richard Chase serves as a stark reminder of what can happen when a system fails to adequately support those with severe mental health issues. The reforms and changes instituted in the aftermath of his case reflect a societal commitment to ensuring such failures are not repeated, but continuous effort and vigilance remain necessary. As the reforms initiated in the wake of Richard Chase's crimes began to take root, different regions across the United States and internationally started to implement and adapt these changes according to local needs and challenges. This chapter examines the varied effectiveness of these reforms, exploring how different communities have responded to the dual demands of treating severe mental health issues and ensuring public safety. Regional variations in implementation. The rollout of integrated care models and enhanced training programs saw varying degrees of success across different states and countries. For instance, urban centers with greater resources and access to medical facilities often reported more successful integration of mental health services with law enforcement and emergency responders. Cities like New York and San Francisco developed robust programs that became models of success, showcasing significant reductions in incidents of violence involving mentally ill individuals. Conversely, rural areas faced distinct challenges. Limited access to specialized psychiatric resources, fewer educational opportunities for advanced training, and logistical issues in deploying ACT teams highlighted the disparities in mental health service provision. These regions struggled to maintain consistent care for individuals similar to Chase, who might require intensive, sustained intervention. Case studies from various regions. One illustrative case study comes from a mid-sized city in the Midwest, where a program called Safe Transition and Reintegration STAR was implemented. STAR focused on individuals transitioning from psychiatric care facilities back into the community. It provided a blend of housing assistance, job training, and continuous psychiatric care. The program saw success in reducing recidivism rates among participants, suggesting that comprehensive, supported transitions could mitigate risks of relapse or criminal behavior. Another case study from a rural area in the Pacific Northwest highlighted the challenges of implementing such programs without adequate funding or personnel. Here, a similar program faced setbacks due to inconsistent funding, leading to gaps in service that occasionally resulted in adverse outcomes. International perspectives. Looking beyond the United States, countries like Canada and the United Kingdom adopted different approaches based on their healthcare systems. In Canada, a more centralized healthcare system allowed for somewhat smoother implementation of integrated mental health services, although regional variations still existed. In the UK, the National Health Service (NHS) leveraged existing structures to integrate mental health services more broadly, focusing on preventive care and community-based treatment options. Modern challenges and technological solutions. As the 21st century progressed, new challenges emerged, including the impact of digital technology on mental health. Social media and increased online interactions have created new stressors and triggers for mental illness, complicating diagnostic and treatment paradigms. However, technology also offered new solutions. Telepsychiatry began to play a significant role, particularly in underserved areas, providing remote consultations and treatment options that were previously unavailable. Mobile apps for mental health monitoring and support became more common, offering tools for individuals to manage their conditions with greater autonomy. These apps also provided valuable data for ongoing treatment adjustments and alerted care providers to potential issues before they escalated into crises. Evaluating the impact. The effectiveness of these varied approaches was frequently assessed through both formal studies and anecdotal feedback from communities. While no single model emerged as universally successful, the combination of local adaptation and adherence to certain core principles, like the integration of services and the emphasis on early intervention, proved critical in managing the complex intersection of mental health and public safety. Ongoing adjustments and future directions. As societal conditions evolved, so too did the strategies for managing mental health. The lessons learned from the Chase case continued to influence new policies and practices, emphasizing the need for flexibility and responsiveness to changing social dynamics and medical insights. As the landscape of psychiatric care evolved in response to past tragedies and ongoing challenges, technological innovations began to play an increasingly pivotal role. This chapter explores the transformative impact of digital technology on mental health services, highlighting both the opportunities and challenges presented by these advancements. Expansion of telepsychiatry. One of the most significant changes in the field has been the widespread adoption of telepsychiatry. This approach has been particularly beneficial in rural and underserved areas, where access to qualified mental health professionals is limited. Telepsychiatry has allowed patients to receive consistent care through video conferences, reducing travel barriers and ensuring continuity of care. For example, in remote areas of Alaska, telepsychiatry has become a lifeline for many communities. Patients who previously had to travel hundreds of miles for a single consultation can now engage with psychiatrists regularly, facilitating better management of chronic conditions and decreasing the likelihood of acute crises. Mobile health applications. The rise of mobile health applications has also dramatically changed the management of mental health. These apps offer a range of functionalities, from mood tracking and meditation guidance to symptom management for conditions like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. They empower patients to take an active role in their treatment, providing them with real-time data about their mental state and facilitating early intervention when patterns suggest a potential decline. A notable example is an app developed for monitoring signs of psychosis. It uses algorithms to analyze speech patterns during phone calls or voice entries, looking for subtle changes that might indicate a worsening of symptoms. Early trials have shown promise in detecting relapses, enabling quicker adjustments in treatment plans. Wearable technology. Advancements in wearable technology have further augmented the toolkit available for mental health care. Devices that monitor physiological indicators such as heart rate, sleep patterns, and activity levels can provide insights into a person's well-being that were previously difficult to quantify outside of a clinical setting. In clinical trials, wearable devices have been used to predict depressive episodes or anxiety attacks based on changes in physiological metrics. This information can prompt users to engage in preemptive strategies, such as stress reduction techniques or direct outreach to their care providers. Challenges and ethical considerations. Despite these advancements, the integration of technology in mental health care is not without challenges. Privacy concerns are paramount, as the collection and analysis of highly sensitive personal data pose significant risks. There is also the issue of digital literacy and access, ensuring that all patients, regardless of socioeconomic status or educational background, can benefit from these technologies. Moreover, the impersonal nature of digital interactions raises questions about the therapeutic relationship. While technology can enhance access and provide valuable data, it cannot fully replicate the nuances of face-to-face interactions with a mental health professional. Looking ahead. As we look to the future, it is clear that technology will remain a critical component of mental health care. The ongoing development of artificial intelligence and machine learning offers potential for even more personalized and predictive care. However, the success of these technologies will depend not only on their technical efficacy, but also on their ethical implementation and the ability to maintain the human element in psychiatric care. The story of Richard Chase remains a stark reminder of what can happen when mental health issues are inadequately addressed. While technology offers powerful tools for prevention and treatment, it must be integrated thoughtfully, with an ongoing commitment to the values of compassion, privacy, and accessibility. As technological innovations continue to reshape the landscape of mental health care, various communities around the world have adopted these tools in unique ways. This chapter delves into specific case studies that illustrate the real-world impact of technology on preventing and managing mental health issues, particularly focusing on scenarios that could potentially prevent tragedies like those caused by Richard Chase. Case Study 1: Remote Monitoring in Rural Communities. In rural North Dakota, a pilot program was launched to address the challenge of providing consistent psychiatric care in remote areas. The program equipped patients with smart wearables that monitored physiological data such as heart rate variability, sleep patterns, and activity levels, factors that are often indicators of mental health status. The wearables were linked to a centralized monitoring system accessed by mental health professionals who could track the data in real time. This system allowed for early intervention. For example, if a patient's data indicated a pattern similar to those preceding previous episodes, the care team could reach out proactively to offer support, adjust medications, or schedule an urgent consultation. This approach not only improved patient outcomes but also significantly reduced the incidence of acute psychiatric emergencies that required hospitalization or law enforcement involvement, showcasing how continuous monitoring can play a crucial role in mental health management. Case Study 2: Urban Telepsychiatry Integration. In a densely populated borough of New York City, a telepsychiatry initiative was integrated into the public health system to improve access to mental health services. The program focused on individuals with a history of serious mental illness and provided them with tablets preloaded with health monitoring apps and teleconferencing tools. Patients could use these tablets to attend virtual therapy sessions, participate in group support meetings, and manage their medication schedules. Psychiatrists and therapists reported that the program not only improved attendance rates, but also helped build a sense of community among patients who often felt isolated due to their conditions. The accessibility of telepsychiatry particularly benefited those who were housebound or had difficulties with transportation, making it a vital resource in urban settings where logistical challenges can often hinder continuous care. Case Study 3: AI-Driven Predictive Analytics. In a collaborative project between a tech startup and a major psychiatric hospital in California, an AI-driven platform was developed to analyze patterns in patient data collected over decades. This platform used machine learning algorithms to identify early warning signs of psychotic breaks or other severe mental health episodes. Patients participating in the program provided regular input through mobile apps, which included mood tracking, symptom reporting, and cognitive games designed to assess their mental state. The AI system analyzed this data to predict potential relapses, allowing clinicians to intervene before patients reached a crisis point. The project not only demonstrated the potential of AI in mental health care, but also highlighted the importance of patient engagement and the collection of high-quality, continuous data for accurate predictions. Challenges and considerations. While these case studies show promising results, they also bring to light several challenges. Issues such as data privacy, the need for constant technical support, and the risk of over-reliance on technology without sufficient human oversight were identified as significant concerns. Moreover, the success of such programs heavily depended on the patient's comfort with technology and their willingness to engage consistently with the tools provided. Reflections on ethical and practical implications. As these technologies become more ingrained in mental health care, ethical considerations continue to evolve. Balancing patient autonomy with proactive care, ensuring equity in access to these technologies, and safeguarding personal data are pivotal areas that require ongoing attention and thoughtful regulation. Across the world, the growing understanding of mental illness, coupled with access to technology, has inspired a wide range of international responses aimed at preventing violence linked to untreated psychiatric disorders. While the details vary by region, the shared goal remains the same: to recognize the early signs of severe mental health conditions and respond with care that is timely, compassionate, and effective. Adapting technology to cultural contexts. In countries such as Japan and South Korea, where mental illness often carries deep stigma, Approaches to integrating technology have been shaped by the need to maintain privacy and discretion. Mental health apps in these regions emphasize anonymous engagement, allowing users to track symptoms, access cognitive behavioral therapy modules, and reach out for help without having to disclose their identity unless they choose to do so. A mobile app developed in Tokyo includes features designed to gently encourage users toward more personal interaction with care professionals. Over time, the platform introduces audio sessions for mental health counselors, gradually building familiarity with professional language and tone, a soft transition toward eventual direct communication. In contrast, Scandinavian countries have long embraced mental health as part of public health. In Norway and Sweden, national systems link digital tools directly with clinical services. Electronic health records, psychiatric consultation scheduling, and community support tracking are fully integrated. Users can monitor their own progress while clinicians receive alerts if a patient's patterns suggest withdrawal or deterioration. Preventive community models. In Kenya, a grassroots model of mental health care has emerged in rural communities, blending traditional support systems with new technologies. Community health volunteers use tablets to conduct basic mental health screenings during routine visits. When symptoms indicating psychosis or severe distress appear, the data is transmitted to a remote psychiatric team in Nairobi, who initiate follow-up care and dispatch mobile teams if needed. This collaborative structure bridges cultural understanding with modern medicine. Local leaders are included in the process, helping to dispel fear and misunderstanding surrounding mental illness, particularly in cases where erratic behavior might otherwise be interpreted through superstition or folklore. Global research and data sharing. International collaboration has become an essential component in the advancement of psychiatric care. Institutions across Europe, Asia, and North America contribute to shared databases that collect anonymized information on treatment outcomes, relapse patterns, and the effects of early intervention. These global networks allow researchers to compare approaches across populations, identifying which methods offer the best results for specific conditions and environments. An initiative led by the World Health Organization has resulted in the creation of a global mental health observatory, which gathers real-time data on psychiatric crises and service responses from over 50 countries. This information informs both policy and funding strategies, helping national governments improve services and prioritize support for at-risk populations. Reform in institutional settings. In many nations, the legacy of institutionalization continues to influence public perception of mental health care. Efforts are underway to reform large psychiatric facilities into community-based care hubs that emphasize integration rather than isolation. In Italy, for example, a decades-long process of deinstitutionalization has shifted the focus to regional mental health centers, supported by mobile crisis units and peer-led recovery groups. These centers operate on principles that recognize the dignity and agency of the individual. Treatment plans are discussed collaboratively, and families are included as active participants. This holistic model has shown significant success in preventing violent episodes and improving long-term outcomes, particularly for individuals with complex, persistent conditions. Training and international standards. To support the expansion of safe and effective mental health care, training programs have increasingly adopted international standards. The Interagency Standing Committee, ISC, co-led by the UN and major NGOs, has developed detailed guidelines for training non-specialists in identifying and supporting people with mental illness in crisis-affected areas. From refugee camps in Syria to post-disaster shelters in Haiti, trained community members now serve as the first point of contact, able to recognize early warning signs, offer basic psychological support, and connect individuals to professional care through secure, encrypted communication channels. Within the United States, the complexities of delivering mental health care at scale have led to the emergence of grassroots networks and nonprofit initiatives that operate alongside formal systems. These organizations often begin at the community level, born from necessity, from a lack of access, or in response to tragedies that left unanswered questions in their wake. Over time, they evolve into lifelines, not only for those living with mental illness but also for their families, neighbors, and caregivers. Origins rooted in experience. Many of these grassroots groups are founded by individuals who have witnessed firsthand the effects of untreated psychiatric conditions. Some are parents who navigated the system while trying to help a son or daughter. Others are survivors of their own mental health crises who found that recovery began only when someone listened without judgment. These origin stories are woven into the structure of the organizations themselves, shaping their mission and their methods. One example is a group in Ohio called Families Together, which began in a church basement and expanded into a statewide network. The founders had each lost a family member to suicide or incarceration related to untreated psychosis. Their initial meetings were quiet circles of shared grief and mutual support. As they learned more about the system and its gaps, they shifted toward advocacy and service, creating a hotline, organizing training sessions, and helping others navigate the often fragmented process of securing treatment. Peer-to-peer support models. At the heart of many successful grassroots programs is the principle of peer support. These are not led by clinicians, but by people who have walked the path themselves. Whether they are managing schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or severe depression, peer counselors offer something that no textbook can replicate: lived experience. In conversations without hierarchy, those in crisis often find it easier to open up, to trust, to believe that recovery is possible. These programs train peers in boundaries, safety protocols, and crisis management, ensuring that the support provided is both compassionate and effective. In cities like Portland and Austin, mobile peer response teams operate around the clock, stepping in when someone is experiencing a psychiatric episode and doesn't require or trust police intervention. Alternatives to emergency calls. Recognizing the dangers that can arise when law enforcement becomes the first responder to a mental health crisis, many communities have sought to create alternatives. One model, developed in Eugene, Oregon, known as Cahoots, Crisis Assistance Helping Out on the Streets, sends trained mental health professionals and medics instead of police to respond to nonviolent psychiatric emergencies. This program operates through the 911 system, making it accessible and efficient. A call comes in, and dispatch determines whether the Cahoots team or police are needed. For individuals in mental distress, the presence of someone in plain clothes, speaking calmly, asking permission before approaching, can mean the difference between escalation and safety. The success of this model has inspired similar programs in cities across the country. Pop-up clinics and mobile outreach. In areas where psychiatric clinics are scarce or overbooked, some organizations have turned to mobile solutions. Vans converted into consultation rooms park outside shelters, libraries, and public housing developments, offering walk-up assessments, medication management, and referrals. These pop-up clinics bring care to the patient, reducing the number of missed appointments and re-engaging those who have fallen out of the system. Volunteers distribute hygiene kits, snacks, and warm clothing alongside mental health screenings, creating an environment that feels welcoming rather than clinical. People are more likely to return when they feel seen as individuals, not as symptoms or problems. Crisis text lines and digital bridges. Understanding that not everyone is comfortable speaking on the phone or in person, some nonprofits have focused their efforts on digital access. Crisis text lines operate 24/7, connecting users to trained responders in real time. These services are especially popular among younger individuals who may not feel ready to describe their feelings aloud, but can type them in a quiet room, in the middle of the night, without fear of being overheard or misunderstood. Digital platforms also serve as bridges between moments of crisis and formal care. A person might begin by texting a few uncertain words, find empathy in the response, and eventually agree to a video appointment or in-person follow-up. Trust builds in increments, and these tools respect that pace. Sustaining the work. Grassroots organizations operate with limited budgets, often reliant on donations, grants, and volunteers. Their continued success depends on partnerships, with schools, hospitals, churches, and businesses willing to contribute space, time, or resources. Some have formed coalitions to amplify their voices, sharing training materials, data, and advocacy strategies. What ties these efforts together is a belief that care begins in relationship, in showing up, in listening before diagnosing. Their work is not a replacement for medical systems, but a complement, filling the spaces those systems can't always reach. The way we understand events, particularly those that unsettle, often begins not with first-hand experience, but with how they are told. The case of Richard Chase, like many before and after it, became shaped not only by court transcripts and psychiatric reports, but by headlines, documentaries, books, and quiet retellings. This chapter considers how media portrays mental illness and violence, how tone influences perception, and how these stories linger long after the facts have settled. Early coverage and public framing. When Chase was arrested, the media did not wait for the trial to define the story. Newspapers labeled him almost immediately with terms designed to provoke. The Vampire of Sacramento moniker first appeared in local headlines before spreading nationwide, chosen not for its accuracy, but for its visceral effect. With just 3 words, he became a figure of legend, something other than human, easier to fear than to understand. Reporters focused heavily on the more grotesque aspects of the crimes. The details, though factual, were arranged for emotional response. Photographs showed the neighborhood, not the victims. Quotes from neighbors mentioned odd behavior, not missed interventions. This pattern of reporting shaped Chase into a cautionary tale, but one without context, one that leaned toward spectacle. Television and the era of true crime. As television became a dominant medium, true crime programming took hold. Episodes on Chase appeared in syndicated crime shows, packaged into neat segments with dramatic narration, ambient music, and scripted interviews. The format rarely allowed for nuance. Stories had to fit into commercial breaks and deliver tension before resolution. Reenactments featured actors moving through dimly lit sets, shadowed hallways, and artificially quiet homes. The viewer wasn't asked to consider what could have been done differently, only to watch what happened. The framing of Chase as a monster continued, reinforced by visual language. Close-ups of blood, locked doors, a spinning newspaper headline. Over time, these programs became popular enough to be constant. Late-night cable schedules filled with them. The repetition turned rare events into something that felt frequent. Public understanding of schizophrenia became entangled with the faces shown on screens, often bearing no resemblance to the vast majority of individuals living with mental illness who pose no harm to others. Books and the promise of depth. In contrast to television, books offer the opportunity for more expansive reflection. Several investigative works on the Chase case included detailed timelines, interviews with family members, and discussions of the broader mental health landscape. Some of these authors approached the subject with care, acknowledging the suffering of victims while also tracing the trajectory of Chase's illness and the systemic failures that accompanied it. Even so, many titles chosen for these books echoed the dramatic language of earlier reporting, emphasizing darkness, madness, and death. Cover designs often featured shadows, blood, or stark black and white portraits. The marketing leaned on the same fear that first drew attention to the story, even if the writing within was more restrained. This tension between content and presentation remains a persistent feature of media that engages with true crime. The reader may come for horror, but some writers use that attention to offer something gentler, more analytical, perhaps even empathetic. The success of that effort depends on tone and on the reader's willingness to slow down. Documentaries and digital reinterpretation. As streaming platforms expanded access to long-form storytelling, documentaries began to shift the narrative structure. Films could take 2 or 3 hours to explore a single case. Directors could layer historical footage, expert commentary, and family interviews to create something closer to meditation than news. In several recent documentaries that reference the Chase case, there is a noticeable attempt to contextualize, placing his crimes within the broader failures of psychiatric care in the 1970s. Yet even here, balance is delicate. Visuals remain powerful. Editing shapes emotion. When images of police reports or crime scene sketches are juxtaposed with soft-spoken commentary, the result can either deepen understanding or reignite sensationalism, depending on the choices made in production. Documentaries often face the question, who is this for? Is it for education, catharsis, warning, or curiosity? The answer varies by viewer, and perhaps by the voice chosen to narrate. Victim representation and ethical shifts. Over time, there has been a slow shift in how victims are portrayed. Earlier media rarely included their stories beyond the moment of their death. Names were listed. Photographs, if shown, were often black and white yearbook portraits. In newer representations, the focus has begun to expand, offering space for families to speak, including memories of the people as they were before tragedy. This rebalancing allows for a deeper kind of mourning. It also invites a broader conversation about how violence disrupts not just individuals but entire communities, and how media can either support healing or delay it. Ethical standards for true crime journalism are still forming. Some platforms have developed internal guidelines. Others rely on public feedback, often shaped through social media. Podcasts in particular have created new formats for storytelling, some more sensitive than others. The intimacy of a human voice in one's ear allows for quieter storytelling, but it also demands more responsibility. Within hospitals, training rooms, and quiet offices, The case of Richard Chase continues to be studied, not for fascination, but for instruction. Among therapists, forensic psychiatrists, clinical social workers, and psychiatric nurses, his name evokes not just a memory of violence, but a series of missed signals, broken systems, and the quiet despair of a man unmoored from reality. This chapter enters those professional spaces where such stories are not retold for drama, but unpacked to understand how to prevent their repetition. The language of diagnosis. In psychiatric education, students encounter the Chase case during discussions of schizophrenia, particularly the paranoid subtype. They read through symptom lists, but also through behavioral timelines, early social withdrawal, onset of delusions, periods of disorganized thought, fixation on somatic complaints. Instructors emphasize patterns, not for labeling, but for recognition. They practice assessments using fictionalized profiles that closely resemble Chase's known behaviors: preoccupations with bodily functions, belief in poisoning, tactile hallucinations, deterioration of self-care. Trainees learn to ask specific questions. When did you first feel that your body wasn't functioning correctly? What do you do when you feel unsafe? Has anyone else noticed the changes in your routine? The goal is to detect early fractures in reality before they widen into something irreversible. Ethics in forensic settings. Forensic psychologists who testify in trials involving psychotic defendants must balance two guiding principles: clinical accuracy and legal clarity. The courtroom does not always mirror the therapeutic space. In training, professionals learn how to translate complex mental states into legal terms without oversimplifying them. With cases like Chase's, the debate centers on criminal responsibility. Did the defendant know that the act was wrong? Was he able to conform his behavior to the law? Trainees are taught to approach these questions without emotion, but also without detachment. They read through Chase's evaluations and behavioral records, often noting how cognitive deterioration went unchallenged for years. They examine where responsibility begins, not just in the individual, but in the structures that surrounded him. Notes from past psychiatrists, emergency room visits, missed follow-up appointments. These become part of the clinical picture. Training through case simulation. In residency programs, Chase's history is sometimes presented in simulation labs. Actors portray patients exhibiting similar symptoms: paranoia, social withdrawal, flat affect, fragmented speech. Students must engage, assess risk, build rapport, and suggest treatment plans under observation. Afterward, sessions are debriefed in small groups. Instructors encourage discussion around uncertainty, emotional reactions, and ethical dilemmas. No single answer is correct. The point is to foster humility and precision. How do you treat someone who refuses medication? When does forced treatment become necessary? What does dignity look like in someone who no longer trusts their own thoughts? These are the questions that extend beyond theory into practice. Crisis response teams and field protocols. For those working outside clinics, on crisis teams, in jails, in shelters, the Chase case is referenced less formally, more as a caution passed between shifts. Workers speak in soft voices about clients who remind them of him. A man who hasn't spoken to anyone in weeks. A woman convinced her neighbors are stealing her thoughts. These workers operate in thresholds, deciding moment by moment when to intervene and how. Protocols have changed since the 1970s. Today, crisis response includes de-escalation training, collaborative safety planning, mobile psychiatric units. But workers still carry the quiet knowledge that no system is perfect. They know what happens when someone like Chase slips through. Supervision sessions offer space for reflection. A social worker might admit they feared for their own safety during a visit. A nurse might share a dream they had after seeing a patient with a 1,000-yard stare. These moments are held without judgment. They are part of the work. Clinical notes and internal dialogue. Therapists who work with clients experiencing psychosis often write their notes with extra care. They document symptoms, of course, but also tone, rhythm, gestures. They watch for change over time, subtle shifts that might signal an improvement or a coming storm. Some keep private logs, not for records but for understanding. Short reflections on a session that felt unusually quiet, or a comment that didn't make sense until hours later. They reread these entries when cases become complicated. They look for what they missed. These professionals don't speak of cases like Chase's in dramatic terms. They don't need to. The gravity of such stories is already understood. Instead, they ask one another, what might have helped earlier? How do we notice more, listen better, respond sooner? To understand the full picture of psychosis, it's necessary to move beyond observation and clinical frameworks, to sit quietly with the words of those who have lived through it. This chapter centers on individuals who have experienced the disintegration of reality firsthand, people whose minds once carried them far from consensus, and who now speak from a place of reflection, not just about their own pain, but about what it meant to be seen, or not seen, by others. The early signs as they're felt, not just observed. Many describe the beginning of their illness as slow, barely noticeable at first. A shift in light that felt off. A sense that time no longer moved in the same way. Thoughts began to repeat or drift in strange loops. Sound took on new intensity. In conversations, words seemed to carry double meanings, as though coded. Some recall looking in the mirror and feeling unfamiliar, not alarmed exactly, just slightly wrong. These sensations were often hidden. Out of confusion, sometimes shame, but more often because there weren't words for them yet. When asked later why they didn't tell anyone sooner, many said they didn't know how. It didn't feel like something broken. It felt like a private evolution no one else could understand. Shifting relationships with reality. As psychosis deepened, the distance between inner experience and shared reality widened. One man described it as being in a theater where everyone else was watching one movie, and he was seeing something entirely different on the same screen. He said he stopped responding to his name, not out of defiance, but because it no longer felt like his. A woman shared how she began believing that her family had been replaced with copies. Her mother's smile seemed rehearsed. Her brother's laugh felt hollow. She withdrew to protect herself from what she thought was happening, and in doing so, cut off the very people who were most concerned. Many recount the way fear began to shape their days. Not dramatic, but steady. A slow burning suspicion. The sense that something, someone, was watching or listening or preparing to act. Delusions were not always outlandish. Sometimes they were rooted in logic, just skewed slightly off-center. A letter from the bank would become a coded warning. A bird call outside the window would signal surveillance. It wasn't chaos, they say. It was a system. It had rules. It made sense inside. The experience of seeking or receiving help. Those who eventually sought help, or were brought into care, described the transition as jarring. Some were relieved, grateful for a moment of stillness after so much noise. Others felt frightened, confused by hospitalization or medication. The loss of autonomy was particularly painful for many. It's not that they didn't want support, but that the process often felt like something done to them, not with them. Several described their first time taking antipsychotics. For some, it was a turning point, a quieting of the constant interference. For others, it was a blunting, a muting of even their most familiar emotions. Side effects, tremors, fatigue, weight gain, made it harder to believe in the path forward. A few stopped taking medication after discharge, not out of denial, but because they missed feeling like themselves, even if that self was unstable. Over time, many returned to treatment under different circumstances, some through outpatient programs, others through peer referrals or community outreach. Trust had to be rebuilt. With the right relationships, some found a rhythm that worked. The role of listening and presence. When asked what helped most answers were not technical. Not a pill or protocol. It was someone staying in the room. Someone who didn't flinch when they said something strange. A therapist who didn't try to explain everything. A friend who walked beside them without asking too many questions. Being heard without correction, they said, was the beginning of clarity. Some found peace in routines, walking the same route each day, keeping a journal even when entries made little sense. Others turned to creative outlets. Drawing helped one woman externalize her hallucinations. Music helped another find rhythm when time felt unstable. Several described recovery not as a return to before, but as a learning to live alongside certain patterns. Voices that once dominated now murmured occasionally. Paranoia, while not gone, had become manageable through practice. Self-awareness became its own kind of treatment. Looking back without shame. Reflecting on what they wished others had done differently, many spoke gently. Not in anger, but with quiet sadness. They wished someone had asked different questions earlier, not what's wrong with you, but what's changed. They wished people hadn't laughed when they said something strange. They wished more teachers, co-workers, neighbors had known the signs. And they wished their stories weren't only told when something went wrong. Some are now part of peer support networks, telling their stories not for attention, but so others might recognize the early stages in themselves or in someone they love. They speak in classrooms, hospitals, shelters, sometimes in courtrooms. They do not offer easy answers. They offer presence. Long after the headlines faded and the courtroom doors closed, the ones most affected by the violence carried forward in quiet ways. Families of the victims, friends left with silence in place of presence, neighbors who once lived in homes that now hold different meanings, all moved through a world that continued at its usual pace, even as their internal clocks reset. This chapter holds space for those who did not seek attention, who did not wish to become part of a public narrative, but whose lives were forever shaped by someone else's collapse. A quiet reshaping of lives. When someone is taken violently, the loss is not confined to a moment. It echoes in unexpected places, in a room that stays untouched, in birthdays that pass uncelebrated, in objects that once seemed ordinary. The families of Richard Chase's victims faced all of this without preparation, without explanation that could soften the absence. Evelyn Myratha's family, already grieving the death of her husband before the events of 1978, experienced a second unraveling when she, her son Jason, and her nephew David were taken. Her home, once a place of safety, became a symbol of something irretrievably broken. Those who knew her described a woman grounded in routine, attentive to others, someone who moved through her days without complaint. After her death, family members withdrew from public life. They declined interviews. They kept their pain close. Dan Meredith, the neighbor caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, was remembered by his friends for his dependability. A mechanic by trade, he often helped others without asking for anything in return. His car remained in his driveway for months after his death, until his family could bear to move it. Each day they passed it, each time the engine failed to start, it reminded them of how quickly and senselessly life can change. Ambrose Griffin's wife never moved from their home. She changed the curtains. She painted the front door. But she stayed. Their children grew up carrying memories of a father who was doing something as simple as bringing in groceries. One described learning to drive years later and feeling a rush of anxiety when pulling into a driveway at night. Grief, he said, comes in ordinary places. Grief in layers. Some of the survivors' grief was complicated by the public nature of the case. Their loved ones were named in articles, discussed in documentaries, sometimes reduced to victims in someone else's story. There was no privacy in mourning. Every anniversary risked being reopened by a retrospective. Every documentary reminded them of the horror without acknowledging the lives that came before it. One family member, speaking years later in a closed support group, said that what hurt most was the way people seemed more curious about the killer than about the people he had taken. They remembered reporters asking questions about crime scene details, but never about what Evelyn liked to cook, or what Jason's laugh sounded like. The process of grieving became something internal, protected, shared only with those who already knew. The subtler ripples. Neighbors who lived nearby often moved within a year. Some couldn't sleep. Others didn't feel safe. The physical geography of a neighborhood shifts when violence enters it. A sidewalk where children used to ride bikes becomes a place people cross the street to avoid. A front porch light stays on all night, even in the warmest months. First responders carried their own kind of grief. The officers who arrived at the crime scenes, the detectives who followed the investigation, the forensic teams who documented every detail, they each carried images they couldn't share with their families. Some developed routines to cope, long drives after work, extra time at the gym, quiet hobbies that required careful attention. Others left the force within a year, unable to continue without seeing echoes of that case in every call. Nurses who handled the evidence or treated Chase in custody spoke less frequently, but among themselves, they shared notes. His detachment, the way he refused to eat unless he believed his food was safe, how he sometimes whispered to himself with no clear emotion. They didn't speak of fear. They spoke of emptiness. Memorials without names. There are no large statues or plaques for the victims of Richard Chase. Families declined those offers. But grief has its own rituals. One family planted a small tree in a community garden and visits it every spring. Another donates to mental health nonprofits on the birthdays of the ones they lost, asking that their names be kept private. For them, Remembrance is not about being seen, but about creating some small restoration in a world where things went too far. In a Sacramento church, candles are lit on certain dates without announcement. Those who remember come quietly, leave quietly. No names are spoken, only a silence that holds them. In the years following Richard Chase's arrest and conviction, institutions tasked with protecting public safety and supporting mental health began to reflect on what had gone wrong. Some changes were immediate, others unfolded over decades, but all were rooted in a growing recognition that silence and separation between systems had left people vulnerable, not just to harm, but to being forgotten. This chapter explores how law enforcement, psychiatric institutions, and oversight bodies attempted to reshape their procedures in the shadow of that failure. Law enforcement refocuses. Within police departments, Chase's case became part of internal training material, not for its notoriety, but for the questions it left unanswered. Why hadn't earlier reports triggered more sustained follow-up? Why had several encounters with mental health crises resulted in short-term detentions but no long-term plans? In response, departments across California began expanding their crisis intervention training, CIT, pairing officers with mental health professionals during specific calls. This shift aimed to de-escalate situations involving psychiatric symptoms and redirect individuals to care rather than custody when appropriate. Supervisors emphasized the need for continuity, ensuring that when someone was flagged as high risk due to erratic or delusional behavior, their file remained active across jurisdictions. Databases were updated to include indicators that someone had previously been held under involuntary psychiatric evaluation, a change that allowed for earlier recognition of patterns. New protocols encouraged officers to slow down during interactions that seemed confusing rather than dangerous. They were trained to notice signs of psychosis that might appear subtle, non sequiturs in conversation, fragmented thought processes, an absence of eye contact that felt more like fear than defiance. These weren't just behavioral cues. They were possible entry points for intervention. Hospital practices re-examined. In psychiatric hospitals and mental health clinics, Chase's history was quietly studied in supervision rooms and policy meetings. Administrators and clinicians began asking more pointed questions about discharge procedures, especially for patients with delusions that involved harm, control, or bodily disintegration. One of the clearest failings in Chase's care had been a lack of continuity between hospitalization and life afterward. Discharge forms, once brief and clinical, were revised to include detailed assessments of risk and functioning. Follow-up appointments were scheduled before patients left the facility, and case managers were assigned more frequently to individuals considered unstable or unmedicated. Clinicians began using more structured tools to evaluate delusions, not just identifying their presence, but rating their conviction, preoccupation, and behavioral impact. These tools helped distinguish between benign beliefs and those that posed greater risk to self or others. They also helped staff notice when patients, like Chase, developed increasingly bizarre bodily concerns, thinking their organs were rotting, their blood was poisoned, or that they had to consume external substances to survive. Documentation systems were updated to track medication adherence over time, and outreach teams were trained to follow up if patients failed to appear. Hospitals also began forming partnerships with community housing programs and public health agencies, recognizing that a discharge to the street was not a treatment plan. Oversight and interagency communication. State-level agencies reviewed how information had been shared, or not, between institutions. At the time of Chase's crimes, there had been few mechanisms to connect psychiatric records with police encounters unless a patient was already involved in the legal system. New legislation created pathways for mental health providers to flag concerns about individuals who might pose an imminent threat, even if they hadn't committed a crime. These changes included legal safeguards to protect patient rights, but they also allowed for earlier review by behavioral health courts or multidisciplinary teams. Judges, social workers, police, and clinicians could now meet to discuss individuals who had crossed multiple systems without receiving consistent support. In some regions, mental health liaison units were embedded directly within court systems. Their role was to advise on cases involving defendants with serious psychiatric symptoms, offering alternatives to incarceration, recommending evaluations, or monitoring compliance with community treatment programs. Professional memory and quiet warnings. Among clinicians, Chase's name was rarely mentioned publicly, but within professional settings, his case remained a reference point. Lectures on forensic risk often began with a timeline of his descent, each point followed by questions. What should have happened here? What did we miss? How does the system need to look different to notice next time? For new psychiatrists, his case served not as a cautionary tale in the abstract, but as a grounding reminder that no diagnosis is neutral. That words like schizophrenia, delusion, or disorganized thinking carry with them an entire infrastructure of care, obligation, and ethical weight. That discharge planning is not paperwork. That someone's paranoia might include the care team itself. And that if no one is responsible for staying connected, disconnection becomes its own form of danger. Some hospitals created internal review committees tasked with examining cases retrospectively when a patient committed an act of violence or died by suicide after receiving care. These committees looked not for blame, but for patterns, aiming to learn from what hadn't worked, to adjust quietly before another name was added to a list. In the spaces between courtroom decisions, clinical assessments, and family heartbreak, there lives a broader conversation, often unspoken, sometimes uncomfortable, about where we draw the line between protecting the individual and protecting others. The case of Richard Chase exists within this tension. It continues to inform policy not just because of what happened, but because of what it revealed about our collective uncertainty in defining danger, autonomy, and care. Legal thresholds and shifting standards. Laws around involuntary psychiatric treatment have always existed in delicate balance. Too little oversight, and those in crisis may go unnoticed until it's too late. Too much intervention, and civil liberties can be compromised. Following the Chase case, legal reforms aim to refine the criteria by which someone could be evaluated for involuntary commitment. Across various states, subtle language shifts began to appear in mental health codes. Terms like gravely disabled were clarified. Imminent risk was debated in legislative sessions, judicial rulings, and clinical ethics panels. Some jurisdictions lowered the threshold for temporary holds when individuals expressed delusional thinking involving bodily harm or displayed signs of psychological decompensation alongside social withdrawal. Attorneys specializing in mental health law began advocating for multidisciplinary review processes. Judges began to hear not just from medical doctors, but from housing coordinators, family members, caseworkers, people who could paint a fuller picture of how someone lived, not just how they scored on a symptom checklist. Yet legal scholars also warned of overreach. Every change to commitment laws came with reminders of the right to refuse treatment, the right to privacy, the right to navigate one's mind without fear of being labeled dangerous simply for being different. The Chase case remained at the center of these discussions, often invoked not by name, but as a silhouette that shaped the background of policy. The politics of mental health funding. Public memory is often short. After the initial outcry following tragedies, attention wanes, and funding often returns to pre-crisis levels. But in some places, the Chase case led to lasting reallocations. Mental health budgets expanded to fund outreach teams, forensic evaluation units, and psychiatric beds in general hospitals. California, in particular, revised parts of its funding model, offering grants to counties that could demonstrate coordination between mental health services and criminal justice systems. Some counties used the funds to create mental health triage centers, places where individuals in distress could be stabilized without being jailed or admitted to overburdened emergency rooms. These centers became examples of what could happen when care was prioritized. Not only did they reduce repeat psychiatric emergencies, but they also created entry points for those who had previously cycled in and out of institutions without sustained help. Still, many advocates noted that true change would require more than buildings and staff. It required cultural shifts in how people spoke about mental illness, how communities supported families, and how early intervention was funded and promoted in schools, workplaces, and housing systems. Media as a mirror and a shaper. Public understanding of severe mental illness continues to be shaped by the way stories are told. True crime media, for all its reach, often simplifies complexity into narrative arcs. The killer, the victims, the timeline. What's rarely explored are the years before, the counseling sessions missed, the neighbors who didn't know what to say, the case managers who were laid off, the system that assumed someone else was responsible. In contrast, documentaries and long-form journalism began experimenting with slower storytelling, pieces that took time to trace lives without reducing them to their worst day. These efforts asked harder questions. What could have changed the outcome? Who tried to help and how? What does prevention actually look like? Writers, podcasters, and filmmakers who took this approach often collaborated with mental health experts. They included disclaimers not just out of legal obligation, but to create space for compassion. They allowed silences to remain. They focused on what was missed, not just what was done. In doing so, they contributed to a more nuanced public dialogue, one where violence was not seen as inevitable, where illness was not conflated with danger, and where responsibility was shared across systems. The emotional landscape of prevention. Those who work in prevention, whether through policy, clinical care, or outreach, often speak of a quiet kind of vigilance. The work is rarely dramatic. It involves noticing small changes, asking questions that go unanswered the first time, sitting through confusion without trying to fix it too quickly. It's in this space that prevention takes root. When people speak about Chase now, in these circles, it is less about the crimes and more about the conditions that allowed them to unfold. The conversations are quiet, deliberate. What warning signs were misunderstood? How did stigma interrupt support? Where could safety have begun, not through force, but through presence? One outreach worker put it simply during a panel discussion: he needed someone to stay before he needed someone to stop him. This sentence, like many shaped by reflection, does not assign blame. It invites awareness. In the end, Richard Chase died alone. Not in the way the world had come to know him, through headlines, sensational detail, or courtroom spectacle, but in the slow, silent fate of a man whose mind had long since lost its connection to shared meaning. His final days passed inside the walls of San Quentin State Prison, under routine observation, amid schedules and surveillance, yet outside of community, far from the voices that once tried to intervene. Prison as a holding space, not a place of healing. Following his conviction and sentencing to death, Chase entered California's prison system already marked by severe mental illness. Incarcerated on death row, he joined a population that included others whose crimes had startled the public. But unlike most of those around him, Chase had never been lucid enough to fully grasp where he was or why he had arrived there. Fellow inmates were uneasy in his presence. Some avoided him entirely. Others spoke later of their attempts to engage him in conversation, only to find themselves staring into silence, or caught in rambling answers about blood, poison, and invisible threats. He was observed keeping strange routines, hoarding food, avoiding certain areas of the yard, occasionally whispering to himself while standing completely still. Psychiatric staff continued to monitor him, though options for treatment were limited. His schizophrenia remained untreated in any consistent way. He often refused medication. When he did accept it, he complained of side effects and later flushed the pills down the toilet. Clinical notes described him as chronically paranoid, intermittently catatonic, and largely unresponsive to therapeutic attempts. Letters from family went mostly unanswered. He had few visitors. The media eventually turned its focus elsewhere. What had once been sensational had, over time, become too difficult to look at without understanding, and too fragmented to follow. The death that came without witnesses. On December 26, 1980, Richard Trenton Chase was found unresponsive in his cell. He had stockpiled his prescribed medication over a period of weeks and ingested the accumulated doses all at once. Toxicology confirmed death by overdose. Official records listed it as suicide. He was 30 years old. There was no note, no final statement, no request for contact. His passing was reported briefly in local newspapers, mostly as a footnote. There were no public ceremonies, no eulogies, no protesters. His remains were cremated, and the ashes were handled by the state. Within the prison, his death did not register as particularly notable. Staff marked it, filed it, moved on. Among inmates, the reaction was mixed. Some expressed relief, others indifference. For those who worked in his unit, there was a quiet acknowledgement, not of closure, but of completion. The absence of resolution. In the broader conversation around mental illness and violence, Chase's death offered no resolution. There was no great reckoning, no final insight. What remained was a case study, discussed in training rooms, cited in policy revisions, referenced in arguments for reform. He became, in many ways, more comprehensible after death than he ever was in life. But among those who had known him before the descent, teachers, former friends, relatives, the grief was more complicated. They remembered a boy who had once ridden a bike down a quiet street, who had once looked at the stars with curiosity, who had been fearful of authority but deeply sensitive in ways he could never quite articulate. They did not excuse what he became, but they also could not forget what he had been before the breaks came. Some carried guilt. Others carried confusion. None carried clarity. The questions that remain. In the years since his death, his story has become a framework. Not a story with an arc, but a map of warning signs, institutional silences, and the consequences of disconnection. He represents a rare and extreme outcome, but one that emerged from very real and traceable roots: untreated illness, societal fragmentation, stigma, and miscommunication across care systems. Those who reflect on his life now do so with a different tone. Not fascination, not fear, but a slow, deliberate inquiry into how someone could become so far removed from help, and how many small moments passed without being seen. Psychiatrists continue to ask how care might have reached him earlier. Lawmakers continue to reference his name when debating criteria for treatment. Families of others with similar conditions continue to wonder what it takes to make the system listen before the crisis arrives. His name still appears in textbooks, occasionally in headlines, sometimes in whispered conversations between professionals. But outside those circles, the memory of his life fades. Not forgotten, but folded back into the larger pattern of what happens when people fall away and no one knows how to bring them back. A final stillness. In telling his story slowly, across chapters that widen the view beyond a single person, what begins to form is not a portrait of monstrosity, but of accumulation. Not an excuse, but a history. Not sympathy, but structure. The recognition that no one becomes what he became in isolation. That behind each tragedy is a series of missed moments, voices unheard, systems under strain, and lives changed by proximity to something no one fully understood. And in the end, there is only this: a door that did not lock, a call that did not reach the right ear, a man whose mind broke too early and too deeply, and whose ending came in silence, just as the warning signs once had. The story remains, not for fear, not for retelling, but for remembering what it costs when someone disappears inside themselves, and we don't follow.